In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for member statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The member for Lilly.
My question is to the Prime Minister. On the 2nd of April, the Prime Minister said, "I don't want a parent to have to choose between feeding their kids or having their kids looked after." But according to today's West Australian, that is exactly what is happening. Why is the Prime Minister hurting Australian families by snapping back childcare arrangements in the middle of Australia's first recession in 3 decades?
The Minister for Education.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for her question, and can I once again, on behalf of all the House, thank those early childhood educators that provided care throughout the pandemic. 99% of all service providers remained open during the pandemic, providing care for essential service workers and also for vulnerable children. And the system that we put in place when demand was collapsing did exactly what it was designed to do, and that was to make sure that care could be provided during the pandemic. Now, as we've seen demand increase, and that demand has now increased to 74%, we are going back to the old childcare system that we put in place nearly 2 years ago. Now, it's just worth noting this. It's worth noting this, and the facts sometimes get in the way when it comes to the other side, that at the moment, out-of-pocket expenses are 3.2% below what they were nearly 2 years ago when we introduced our childcare system.
The member for Kingston.
The member for Kingston can interject, but that is ABS data.
Members on my left, I just say to the minister, the member for Kingston can't interject. That's the point I just made.
Well, that's a blessing, Mr Speaker. So, out-of-pocket expenses are 3.2% below what they were when we introduced the childcare reforms nearly 2 years ago. And everything that we have done in putting in place our new package has been done consulting with the sector. And we said to the sector, what is it that you think we need to do, because as demand is increasing, you're asking us to be able to allow you to meet that demand. And one of the key things that they said, they wanted to see changes to the activity test. And that is exactly what we have done. That is exactly what we have done. They also said that they wanted to make sure that they could continue to provide support for the childcare workers in the sector. And that is exactly what we have done through a $708 million transition fund. And what we said to the sector was we want an employment guarantee which comes with that. And that is exactly what they've delivered. So I thank the sector again for the way that they have provided care throughout the coronavirus pandemic. If you look across the globe, they have been an absolute standout, and that is why we want to support them as demand increases.
Concluded, and I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is also to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on the Morrison government's JobMaker plan to drive our recovery from the coronavirus pandemic, particularly how building an outward-looking, open and sovereign trading economy, including through negotiation of a United Kingdom free trade agreement, will create jobs and economic growth?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for North Sydney for his question. The government's JobMaker plan, a plan to ensure that we restore and grow jobs in this country, to get Australians back into work, to restore their fortunes of the many things that have been taken from them through this economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 global pandemic, Mr Speaker. A key part of that is the principle that Australia will always remain an open trading economy. Australia will not shrink as a result of this crisis. We will grow again, Mr Speaker, and we will look outward for that growth as well as inward, Mr Speaker, as we reclaim those jobs that have been taken from Australians. And we will also ensure that we are part of trusted and tested and secure supply chains. And Mr Speaker, our performance as a government when it comes to trade speaks for itself. Exporters now have access, since we first came to government in 2013, to 1.7 billion extra consumers. 70% of our two-way trade, Mr Speaker, is now covered by export agreements, up from 26% when we were first elected. Some 8,947 more businesses are exporting under the term of this government, Mr Speaker, and under the previous government actually fell by over 50 businesses in their 6 years in governments. Mr Speaker, 250,000 extra jobs were created in the traded sector, Mr Speaker, before the COVID crisis hit. 2019 saw a trade surplus, Mr Speaker, of $67.6 billion, and that is after inheriting a trade deficit from those opposite of some $10 billion. And even in the most recent March quarter, 0.5% was added, Mr Speaker, to the quarterly's growth because of net exports, ensuring that the outcome in the March quarter saw that we were one of the best-performing developed economies in the world as we go through the COVID crisis. Now, Mr Speaker, the IA-CEPA agreement will come into effect on the 5th of July, and I spoke to President Widodo again this week, and we are very much looking forward to that coming into effect in just a few weeks' time. The EU Free Trade Agreement has been a topic of regular engagement between me and the Trade Minister and our counterparts of many European nations, that we've been engaging with those European nations through the course of the COVID crisis. But today, the UK Free Trade Agreement negotiations formally open, and I look forward to the Trade Minister advancing that cause in both countries' interests to ensure, Mr Speaker, we can achieve what will be the significant outcomes that we believe will be available. Only 1% of their beef imports, 7% of their wine imports and 1% of their horticultural and dairy imports come from Australia. And, Mr Speaker, having been part of the EU for so long, there is a great opportunity for us to now re-engage that trade with the United Kingdom. Mr
has
Speaker.
concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How many more Australians are unemployed because of the way in which the Prime Minister designed JobKeeper?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, JobKeeper is supporting over 3 million Australians, Mr Speaker. Over 3 million Australians.
And I hear
the interjection from the Leader of the Opposition saying it should be 6. It should be 6, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister resume his seat. Prime Minister. Members on both sides. Members on both sides, I have not called the Leader of the Opposition yet. Not surprised if people mishear, given the level of interjections. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
There was no mishearing, Mr Speaker. He was the one who said there'd be 6 million, and that was my interjection, and he knows it.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the Treasury's initial estimate was 6 million.
The member for
Secretary of the Treasury
member for Sydney. The member for Sydney's warned.
But, Mr Speaker, I'm pleased that only 3 million had to use that program, and not the 6 million, Mr Speaker. Only the Leader of the Opposition seems disappointed that 3 million Australians weren't in need of the JobKeeper program, Mr Speaker. Only the Leader of the Opposition seems to take some sort of pleasure in the fact, Mr Speaker, that estimate of 6 million Australians needing the JobKeeper program and a demand-driven program were not necessary. What I can tell the Leader of the Opposition is this, is our government is fighting for jobs and the Labor Party is fighting each other.
About to call the member for Dawson. The member for Barton will cease interjecting. Members on both sides, the level of noise is far too high. You know what follows if it doesn't correct itself. I call the member for Dawson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government's JobMaker plan is ensuring our trading relationships are supporting regional Australia and how the JobMaker plan is supporting regional Australia in general as part of the recovery from COVID-19.
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, this morning the member for Dawson announced a 10-tonne hammer and crane was going to descend upon the Mackay Northern Access Upgrade project. Now that's something that's going to have as big an impact as the member for Dawson himself had when he landed 10 years ago in this place, Mr Speaker. He's the voice of the North. He's the voice of the North, and he talks about jobs. He talks about investment. He talks about regional development.
Member for Shortland.
He talks about trade. He talks about all the things that are important for the far north. He talks about all the things that are important for Mackay, for the Dawson electorate. Mr Speaker, the member for Dawson talked about how this machine will drive 36 piles ranging from 9.5 metres to 12.5 metres in length and weighing between 6 and 8 tonnes each into the Goose Pond Creek. And we are working to not only maintain supply and boost jobs through this project, through the Mackay Northern Access upgrade, but indeed with everything that we do. That is $96.3 million of investment from the federal Liberal and Nationals government. It is going to create more than 150 jobs, and he knows, as we all do, how it's going to improve the logistics, how it's going to improve the freight supply chain in his area. And commuters in Dawson are being supported through the COVID-19 crisis with every measure that we are putting out there, out into the economy to drive jobs, to address the health situation, yes, but also to support our economy. And there's no greater fighter for the economy of Dawson than the member for Dawson himself. He knows about how our 14 current free trade agreements are playing such a significant role in providing export opportunities for his local area. He understands that. His local area produces sugar cane. It is Sugar City, Mackay. Indeed, beef, seafood, fruit and vegetables, the list could go on and on and on. And through COVID-19, these producers, the ones in Dawson, the ones in far north Queensland, the ones right across the nation, they are being supported by our $110 million International Freight Assistance Mechanism. Now, already 1,380 flights under that mechanism have carried more than 25,000 tonnes of Australian produce to international markets, including some great food from the Mackay region. This is but one way of how we have ensured the supply chain, and we have backed our producers, backed those wonderful far north Queensland producers, those wonderful farmers. State border closures, they mean that it's costing jobs. And whether it's, and I know Mackay is a long way from the border, but it's costing jobs in Mackay, it's costing jobs in the far north Queensland, and certainly we need to make sure that we get those border closures ended so that we can get on with producing more jobs and more trade.
Minister's time has concluded. The member for Rankin.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. According to the Reserve Bank minutes released yesterday, the unemployment rate has been suppressed because an unusually high number of people have dropped out of the labour force. With hundreds of thousands of jobs already lost, hundreds of thousands of people having dropped out of the labour force, and hundreds of thousands of people in jobs but working 0 hours, why won't the Treasurer backtrack on his plan to snap back support for Australian workers in September?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Rankin for his first question in 2 weeks, Mr Speaker. It's a great pleasure, Mr Speaker. He's too busy doing interviews for the weekend.
Members
Australian
on
profile.
both sides. The member for Rankin. Treasurer has the call.
Sorry, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the member for Rankin can't blame the media for everything, and the reality is we've been through a one-in-a-century pandemic, Mr Speaker, which is unfortunately putting people out of work and sending them onto the job seeker program, and those who have seen reduced hours are going on to the JobKeeper program. Now, Mr Speaker, what we did see in relation to jobs was yesterday some ABS weekly payroll jobs data, which actually said that the number of total payroll jobs had increased by 1% through May. Now, this is the start, Mr Speaker. This is the start of the recovery that we're seeing as the restrictions are eased as a result of our country's success in flattening the curve. And it was particularly important, Mr Speaker, to see payroll jobs worked by females increase by 1.4% through May, compared to 0.4% for males, Mr Speaker. Now, the member for Rankin refers to the RBA minutes. Now, Mr Speaker, I also saw the RBA minutes, and in those minutes it said the number of jobs had stabilised or increased a little, suggesting that the total decline in hours worked may be less than being previously feared. Now, Mr Speaker, there's the member for Rankin always talking about the economy. Always talking down the economy, right? In a desperate and delusional bid for relevance, the member for Rankin is always talking down the economy. But there it is, in the Reserve Bank minutes that he seeks to quote, talking about how the economy is coming back, Mr Speaker, how the economy is coming back because of the success that we have had as a nation in flattening the curve. Now, Mr Speaker, I've said at this dispatch box before, and so has the Prime Minister. Our success on the health front is allowing us now to get the economy back into the recovery phase. And if you look at the OECD's report just recently, they said that the Australian economy will grow by around 4% next year, and that the contraction this year will be no means as severe as it is in other countries. So I say to the member for Rankin, I don't blame the media. Understand the fact that we have gone through a once-in-a-century pandemic, and I know that he's after one other job, but at least he should try to do his.
Members on my left, the member for Warringah.
To the Prime Minister, state governments have led the way with prohibitions on industry donations and anti-corruption watchdogs. In contrast, at federal level, we still have no national integrity and anti-corruption watchdog and no prohibition on political donations from property development, mining, tobacco or gambling industries. This is the virus corrupting our democracy. Rather than introducing legislation to bring federal donations laws up to scratch and protect our democracy, your government has introduced legislation to get around stronger state government laws. Why?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for her question. I've asked the Attorney if he wished to speak to the matters of the Integrity Commission issues that the member has raised. The Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters is the committee which I have indeed served on when I first come into this place. Many members have served on those committees as we view the electoral process and the elections on each occasion they're conducted, and the matters which you make mention of are reviewed, and I understand that is still taking place now from the last election, and I look forward to seeing its report. But the Attorney may want to speak to the issues regarding the Integrity Commission, but I'd be very surprised if those opposite in the Labor Party would be asking questions about integrity today.
The Prime Minister has the call. Oh, so the Attorney General has the call.
Thank you, Mr.
Members
Speaker.
on both sides.
I thank the member for her question. I might just quickly touch on the electoral issue as well. There have been a number of reforms that the government has instituted in recent years with respect to donations, and many of them relating to foreign donations. And I'm very happy to provide a summary of those to the member individually. Of course, giving the analogy of the state prohibitions that have existed in some states with respect particularly to property developers, there are issues at a federal level with those types of laws which go back to a range of decisions of the High Court on constitutional matters, going back to the ACTV decision and the implied freedom of political communications. So those comparisons, if I might say respectfully, aren't perfect comparisons. With respect to the Integrity Commission, as the member is aware, and we've discussed the model that the government has got for an Integrity Commission, and I know that the member prefers some features of some other models to those that the government is proposing, but nevertheless there's been serious design attention to that Integrity Commission body. We have put $106.7 million worth of new money and allocated that to the Integrity Commission over the forward estimates. That excludes, I should say, the $40.7 million of existing funding for ACLI. By comparison, members opposite promised $58.7 million, so the commitment that we've given is almost $89 million greater to that Integrity Commission. Obviously, there have been other priorities for the government, whilst, as the opposition have noted, hundreds of thousands of Australians are very sadly lost jobs are in 0 hours now because of the COVID pandemic, but we are now revisiting the issue of the Integrity Commission and our legislation, and no doubt you and I will have further conversations on that.
The member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer inform the House how Australia's record run of trade surpluses is helping to hasten our recovery by expanding new markets and opportunities, and is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Canning for his question and acknowledge his chairmanship of the Intelligence Committee. And he, unlike other members of that committee, has informed me that he doesn't have any secret hidden cameras in his office, Mr Speaker. But, Mr Speaker, he, like members on this side of the House, are very proud of the fact that under the coalition we have increased the percentage of free trade agreements covering two-way trade from 26% to 70%, Mr Speaker, and the ambition is to get to 90% by 2022, and we have entered into free trade agreements with China, with Japan, with Korea, with Indonesia, with Peru, with Hong Kong, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Mr Speaker. And this has helped create the first current account surpluses in more than 40 years, Mr Speaker. In the March quarter, the current account surplus was $8.4 billion, a record amount. And as a percentage of GDP, it was the highest since June 1973. Now, Mr Speaker, trade and free trade creates jobs. 1 in 5 Australian jobs are related to trade. In the last 5 years, more than 240,000 trade-related jobs have been created. And businesses, Mr Speaker, who are exporting are more likely to employ 23% more people and to be 13% more productive and to have wages that are 11% higher. And this has created jobs right across the country, in businesses in every electorate of this country, Mr Speaker, like in Canning, where they have 3 out of the nation's 6 alumina refineries, Mr Speaker, in Boddington, in Wagerup and in Pinjarra, Mr Speaker. Now, Australia is the world's largest bauxite, Mr Speaker, alumina exporter, the world's largest alumina exporter, and it's those refineries that are helping creating $10 billion of export revenue each year. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm asked about are there any alternative approaches. Well, we know when the Labor Party were in government, when it came to trade, their position was characterised by indecision and inaction. We didn't see movement on the free trade agreement with China. We didn't see it with Japan. We didn't see it with Korea. Now, Mr Speaker, what was their strategy when it came to trade? Well, they went to the Labor handbook, opened up Chapter 1. What was it? Higher taxes, Mr Speaker. Higher taxes, a carbon tax and a mining tax, which the member for Rankin, when it came to the mining tax, what did the member for Rankin say? He said the fruits of which are yet to be understood, Mr Speaker. The fruits of which are yet to be understood. That's in his book. Only the coalition can trust
the
to
Treasurer's
create more
time
jobs.
has concluded. The member for Canberra.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Women from the Yass Valley are currently forced to travel an hour to Canberra or Goulburn to give birth. As a result, a number of women have been forced to give birth on the side of the Barton Highway. Does the Prime Minister agree that that is unacceptable?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I'm pleased to let the member know that's why we've committed $150 million to upgrade the Barton Highway, which includes the duplication
Members on my left.
of the highway from the ACT
Members on my left.
towards Murray.
Prime Minister will pause for a second.
And this
Prime Minister has the call. Prime Minister has the call. Member for Shortland is warned. The member for Blaxland will cease interjecting. The member for Rankin is now warned for incessant interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I was asked about the Barton Highway. I was also asked about health, and I'll come to both matters, Mr Speaker. So the commitment will improve safety and reduce travel times to all motorists, Mr Speaker, on that busy stretch from Yass to Canberra. when it comes to issues on regarding hospitals, Mr Speaker, under the new hospitals agreement we have signed with the New South Wales Government, there will be some $40 billion provided over the next 5 years, delivering an additional $9.3 billion for funding in that hospital sector. Now, specifically also I can note that the southern New South Wales Local Health District received $107.8 million in community activity-based funding for public hospital services in 2018-19, and that is an increase of $64.5 million, or 149% on what we inherited back in 2012-13, Mr Speaker. So this government has increased funding for hospital services in that area, Mr Speaker, and in New South Wales and across the country, Mr Speaker, to ensure that we can provide the support, whether it is for maternity services or other important hospital services all around the country, Mr Speaker. We're fighting, Mr Speaker, for the funding to ensure that it can continue to be provided, whether it's in Eden Monaro or anywhere else. The Labor Party, as I said before, Mr Speaker, are only fighting each other.
The member for Coulton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is progressing its jobs and economic growth agenda by pursuing a United Kingdom free trade agreement?
The Minister for Education.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for her question and acknowledge her passion, in particular when it comes to international higher education and the contribution that it makes in creating 250,000 jobs in this nation. Mr Speaker, today we received some wonderful news. We are going to formally launch a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom, our 7th largest trading partner. Now, the great news about this is that for those who can remember, dating back to 1973, and I must confess I was a young boy growing up on a family farm, when the UK entered the European Economic Community, it had a devastating impact on our farming community. What we saw were lower quotas and higher tariffs when it came to beef, when it came to dairy, when it came to lamb, when it came to wool. And it meant for our farmers some very difficult times. What they learnt was that they had to diversify, and they have diversified and diversified successfully. But what this gives us is the opportunity to right that wrong. Many of them felt harmed by what the United Kingdom did in those times, and we can now fix this because now consumers in the UK, rather than having to look at a French chop,
Member for Lawler,
but they will now be able to look again at an Australian chop. They won't have the choice of a Belgium steak, they'll also have the choice of a good Australian Hereford or Angus steak, and this is what we're going to be able to achieve through this FTA. We're going to be able to do other things as well. We're going to be able to build on our services exports, and we've already got a very strong services exports relationship with the United Kingdom, but that will continue to grow and it will continue to provide jobs for our local communities. And one such example of that, which we've already seen, is British-based AstraZeneca's $200 million investment to expand manufacturing in Sydney, creating 250 jobs, resulting in total export value of $4.4 billion over the next 5 years. Mr Speaker, this government wants to create an open trading environment globally because we know that we have the competitive advantage through our economy to be able to capitalise on that, to be able to create jobs. And this free trade agreement with the United Kingdom, coupled with our endeavours to have a free trade agreement with the European Union, will once again diversify our export markets. They'll reach over 70% if we can successfully land these FTAs and create more jobs in the Australian community.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Health. According to the most recent public data from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, 1 in 8 people in the Eden Monaro area skip Medicare services because they can't afford them. Can the Minister provide the House with any more recent data And won't cutting bulk billing incentives in Queanbeyan make the situation even worse?
The Minister for Regional Health has the call.
I thank the Shadow Minister for his question. There's been no cut to bulk billing services in Queanbeyan. And I get frustrated that the member opposite wants to come in here and scare the people of Eden Monaro. I just had a bit of a look at the Riverside Medical Centre this afternoon. If the minister wanted to see a doctor in Queanbeyan, might get the 240, the 250, the 320, the 340, and the people of Queanbeyan get the bulk billing incentive like everywhere else in Australia does. He might be interested to know that in other parts of Eden Monaro they actually get the rural bulk billing. And the changes, there's a scare campaign coming up, and I can tell you there has been some changes to the geographic eligibility for the modified Monash model, and the Labor Party was so incensed about these changes in October last year that they supported them. They didn't actually get rushed through in the middle of the night. They laid on the table for 15 days these changes to the rural bulk billing eligibility program. And so this side of the House has a rural program worth $550 million, and the Labor Party was so incensed when it was introduced in 2018 in May that the then Shadow Minister, the member for Ballarat, said there are many measures in the budget that Labor has welcomed. These include a new rural health strategy. That was on the 15th of May 2018. So, Mr Speaker, this side of the House is not indulging in scare campaigns. We have got a program in place to train doctors that have the skills, a broader range of skills, GPs with obstetric skills, GPs with emergency training, GPs with psychological training. And so places like Yass, which I might add, the Labor government in New South Wales removed maternity services in 2004, so we will have staff training junior doctors that have a broader range of skills that are suitable to go and work in regional areas. We are trying to change the dynamic and the message so that rural Australia is a place to go and have a meaningful career in medicine. And those opposite continue to scare people right across Australia. They've been doing it here about a month ago, talking about cuts to bulk billing that did not happen. Did not happen. As a matter of fact, during COVID-19, we doubled the bulk billing incentive rate. We introduced telehealth in a very short time so that people in regional Australia could be in touch with their doctors. On this side of the House, we support...
The Minister's time has concluded. The member for Cowper.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. Will the Minister update the House on what action the Morrison-McCormack government is taking to expand trade opportunities for our agriculture sector?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Cowper for his question and acknowledge the rich history that the Cowper electorate has in the agricultural sector in production but also export. And the farmers of Cowper understand better than anyone the importance of trade. They understand that we're a nation of 25 million people. We produce enough food for 75 million people. So we need to engage with the world, we need to trade with the world. And they appreciate and acknowledge the work that this government has done over many years in securing free trade agreements with China, Japan, Korea, Peru, Hong Kong, Indonesia, that little $13.2 trillion marketplace that those opposite said was all too hard to crack, the TPP-11. And now Indonesia comes in on the 5th of July, and tonight we start our negotiations with the UK. And this morning I was fortunate enough to catch up with the High Commissioner. And we talked about not only the traditional opportunities of agriculture, but the new opportunities in trade in agriculture, the research and development, the technology of being able to allow the UK to invest in the best mines, agricultural mines in the world, right here in Australia, to help both our production systems and theirs, to enrich our production systems not only at an agricultural product level, but a human capital level. And that's why we've continued to make sure that we've been giving our producers the opportunity to spread their risk. And we've done that also in other markets by investing in 21 agricultural counsellors who work in embassies and high commissions around the world, and they work at government-to-government level, trying to reduce technical barriers and get more market access. These can sometimes be the real barriers for our producers to be able to access markets and have a more streamlined export system. And we'll continue to look at streamlining that system further with investments in technology here back in Australia for our exporters to be able to streamline that process. But this can all be in vain, particularly if we don't continue to protect brand Australia. And the federal government is committing $850 million in biosecurity measures. But today I was proud to introduce a bill that also strengthens and sends a message to those international visitors that we welcome and to Australian citizens who travel around the world and come back, that we are looking to increase the penalties for those on those passenger declaration cards in today's value from $420 to $2,520 to make sure we continue to send that strong message around biosecurity. And this complements the measure that we put in place before the election, where for the most serious biosecurity breaches, we gave our biosecurity officers the opportunity to cancel the visas on the spot, to send them home and not allow them to reapply for a visa for up to 3 years. This shows the importance of trade to the agricultural sector to regional Australia. So we're not just protecting, but we're also enhancing agricultural trade and regional Australia.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Health. The Queanbeyan GP Super Clinic says that it has had to increase its fees, due in part, and I quote, to the removal of Queanbeyan from the rural and regional classification for bulk billing incentives by the Commonwealth Government. Does the minister accept this cut is hurting Queanbeyan?
The Minister for Regional Health has the call.
I thank the Shadow Minister. I can say that in the last round of changes to the modified Monash model, Queanbeyan was MM1. It is still MM1. There's been no changes to Queanbeyan, and I dispute the quote the members got. I once again point to the Riverside Medical Centre in Queanbeyan, where there's an appointment every 10 minutes this afternoon in a clinic, super clinic that does receive the bulk billing incentive. So there's been no changes to the MM model in Queanbeyan, and it would be better if the minister, the Shadow Minister, stopped trying to scare the people of Queanbeyan.
The member for McMahon seeking to table a document.
Mr Speaker, the statement by the Queanbeyan GP Super Clinic, which is announcing a fee increase due, and I quote, to the removal of Queanbeyan from the rural and regional classification for bulk billing incentives by the Commonwealth Government.
Is leave granted?
Leave is not granted.
Leave is not granted. The member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. Will the Attorney inform the House what Commonwealth laws exist in relation to surveillance devices? Are there any recent events that raise questions about these laws in relation to members of Parliament? And is the Attorney aware of any alternative approaches?
Just getting everything in order. The Leader of the House.
I thank the member for her question, and it is a very good question. Of course, at a federal level, there are very strict rules about the use and authorised use of surveillance devices, which essentially restrict that use to law enforcement agencies. And as the member is aware, of course, recently we also passed very important laws to counter the influence of or interference with members of Parliament. So, frankly, I think that everyone in this Parliament would agree that the idea that a non-law enforcement device, if you like, appeared to have been installed in the office of any member of this Parliament is a matter of some serious concern. I think it's a matter also of some obviousness that the level of concern that we might have and whether or not that matter might require further inquiry would turn very substantially on whether the member in question had themselves authorised or otherwise had knowledge of the installation of that device. That seems to be a very obvious and first question. And in fact, so obvious is that question that obvious proposition was put to the opposition leader this morning by Neil Mitchell, who said this. He said, "He's a member of your backbench, he's right in the middle of this, and you haven't even spoken to him." Now, the answer, Mr. Speaker, was, well, I haven't, because it's very clear that I wasn't aware of the member's office involvement until much later on.
The Attorney-General will resume his seat. The member for Sydney has already been warned. The Manager of Opposition Business.
On a point of order, I didn't rise to object to the question because the question was framed in the general. The Attorney-General now is going to specific matters that are under investigation. Right. And of all the portfolios in this House,
the member for Fisher,
they are.
Member for Fisher is warned.
Of all the portfolios,
could you just go back a sentence, because I didn't hear that with the interjections from my right.
As well as IBAC.
Now that the Attorney-General has gone to the specific, he's referring to a situation which is under investigation by authorities. And of all the portfolios, the Attorney-General is the one that ought not be doing that. There are serious rules and references in practice to us avoiding reference where it could affect an investigation. He is objecting, and I know that there's a broad principle in favour of debate occurring, but the argument that the Attorney-General is going to is to actually argue that members should be interfering and taking a role with respect to the investigation.
Right.
I'm listening very carefully to the Attorney. The Manager of Opposition Business makes a reasonable point, which is why I'm listening very carefully. The practice makes clear that debate shouldn't be curtailed, and there's a number of principles where that arises. When it comes to sub judice, there really is a staged approach, and I've been through this a number of times. I mean, essentially, matters become serious if charges are laid or a jury's been appointed, and the practice makes that very clear. So whilst I'm listening very carefully to the Attorney-General, I think for me to pull him up on what he's said would set new precedent, or to try and pull him up because of what he might say would set new precedent. So I'm just going to allow him to continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the Leader of the Opposition didn't ask the obvious question because he didn't understand until much later on after—
The Leader of the House will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Further to the point of order of the Manager of Opposition Business, and it goes to the comments of the Attorney-General, including the correct quote from me. The question that I was asked this morning went to whether I had made inquiries. The comment that he used indicated that, and if he looks at further of the transcript, he will see that I made the point that on Sunday night, before the Premier of Victoria had initiated the police and IBAC inquiry, I was not aware that it was a Member of Parliament's office. I had no idea where that office was.
Leader of the Opposition to wind up
IBAC,
I'm giving the Leader of the Opposition a lot of latitude, but this is really an indulgence rather than a point of order. And what I really need to do is hear from the Attorney-General, and if members feel they've been misrepresented, there's an opportunity for them to deal with that at the end. But I've given latitude given the nature of the question and the answer, but I really do need to hear from the Attorney.
So I think, Mr. Speaker, that's precisely the point, because the Leader of the Opposition said, I didn't recognise the office. Right? So the Leader of the Opposition must be the only keen political observer in Australia who missed both the map for the Federal Electoral Division of Holt and missed the back of the election poster with the member's name on it in the relevant footage. And everyone in his office must have missed those things. That does sound quite remarkable, don't you think, members? And the next question that was asked of the Opposition Leader was that if he hadn't satisfied himself that the recording was authorised or otherwise known to the member, given the member's very sensitive position on the Intelligence Committee and given that he had had his office bugged, would the Opposition Leader call in the Federal Police? And the Opposition Leader said, well, they make their own decisions. Well, that has always been the government's view, but that is a remarkable turnaround in policy of the members opposite. Because, of course, the Leader of the Opposition had at his disposal the greatest serial referrer to the AFP of these types of matters in the history of modern politics, the Shadow Attorney-General, the member for Isaacs, who, as to the prolific nature of his referring ability, this is the only one he doesn't seem to want to refer, which is quite strange, but as to that prolific nature of his referring ability, the journalist Anika Smethurst wrote in her book, no less, "Despite screaming for leniency when my house was raided, Shadow Attorney-General Mark Dreyfus wrote to the PM encouraging him to call the police." A simple question and answer as a leader of your party to your backbencher to clear this up.
The time has concluded. The member for Hindmarsh.
My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to evidence to the Independent Commission Against Corruption that the Minister for Energy was involved in laundering illegal donations through the Liberal Party front organisation known as the Free Enterprise Foundation. What action has the Prime Minister taken to investigate the Minister's conduct?
Members on my left, the Leader of the House.
A very big turnaround from their views previously, but this clearly is a matter outside the ministerial responsibilities of the Prime Minister. It requires knowledge as to donations which are not inside the Prime Minister's responsibilities.
I'll just say to the— I'll come to the member for Bass. Just say to the Leader of the House, there is a way that question could have been framed that would have made it closer, if not in order, but I think as it's— Oh, all right then. Well, that'll be quicker. Let's go to the member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on recent steps the Morrison government has taken in the fight to protect Australian children from exploitation and abuse? And how will this support the efforts of law enforcement authorities? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question, and I, in doing so, acknowledge that she is a survivor of child sexual abuse and an advocate on behalf of other people, other adults who face this terrible injustice as a child. She's an incredibly brave woman, and I really pay tribute to you, Bridget. Mr Speaker, on behalf of all victims of child abuse, and in fact all of those investigators who do that very difficult job of working in this area of police investigation, the government has for the last 3 years fought to get through legislation in the Senate to make sure that we could have meaningful jail terms for people that had committed these heinous crimes against children. And we have fought tooth and nail against the Labor Party and the Greens, but eventually, Mr Speaker, we have got in place this legislation which will make a big difference to the victims, and it will make a big difference to the police investigators. It will give more meaning to the efforts, to the sacrifice that those police investigators make. The work that they do with families and with survivors is quite remarkable and a great tribute to their professionalism, and we do recognise that the numbers are quite significant, unbelievably significant. And this is a very difficult topic to talk about as a country, but as I've said to the House before, it's a topic that we must discuss. We can't allow it not to be aired in this parliament or in lounge rooms across the country, because parents need to speak to their children, and we need to have a greater awareness and a greater ability for children to speak up to their parents or to a person of responsibility in their community. I want to give you one example, Mr Speaker. In 2012, the Crown had a case against an individual named Van der Zijden. This offender sexually abused 3 young boys aged between 11 and 13. He was convicted of 8 counts of sexual conduct involving a child under 16 and 7 counts of sexual intercourse with a child under 16. He was sentenced to 3 years and 6 months imprisonment with a non-parole period, unbelievably, of just 21 months. Now, the Attorney-General and myself, along with the Prime Minister and others, been absolutely determined to introduce this law, and I thank all of my colleagues for the support, because in this case it would have meant that the offender would have been subject to a mandatory minimum penalty of 6 years imprisonment and up to a maximum 25 years for each incidence of sexual intercourse with a child outside Australia. So, Mr Speaker, we do know that many of these children don't recover, that the mental health issues continue for their life, and it's why we do need to put in place a deterrent. It's why the government was absolutely determined to act on behalf of these children and also the investigators. I commend the Prime Minister and everybody involved in our leadership team for making sure this became a reality.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. In December 2017, there were more than 100,000 older Australians waiting for the home care package for which they had been approved. 2 years later, still more than 100,000 older Australians were waiting. Why?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. From both my time as Treasurer and both my time as Prime Minister, at every single occasion we have increased the funding available for in-home aged care places, Mr Speaker. We have put a priority on that in budget after budget, putting important resources on that issue as a matter of priority. We launched, Mr Speaker, I initiated, when I first acted as a Prime Minister, was to initiate the Royal Commission into aged care to address these very issues, Mr Speaker. We will continue to put more funding into aged care and in particular into in-home aged care places at every opportunity we have, which has been my practice, and it will continue to be my practice. Early this week when I spoke to the CEDA Forum and I talked about our commitment of guaranteeing the essential services that Australians rely on, that just didn't relate to the record funding agreements we have put in place with the states and territories on hospitals, on schools. I went further to specifically say that we would be continuing to address the challenges in the areas of aged care, in-home aged care and disability care, Mr Speaker. And the only way you can provide support for those essential services is if you properly manage the economy, Mr Speaker. That's how you fund these services. You don't fund them, you do not fund them through higher taxes. You fund them by ensuring that Australia re-emerges from the COVID-19 crisis with a stronger economy that gets people back into work. That's how you lift the revenues, and that's how you can say to those older Australians who are looking to have those in-home aged care places, that's how you can pay for them, Mr Speaker. Now, those opposite do not have a plan for how they would grow the economy. They don't have one, Mr Speaker, and that's why they cannot look Australians in the eye, whether it's in Queanbeyan or anywhere else, Mr Speaker, and tell them that they can fund services because they do not have a plan to how they can grow the economy on the other side and through this crisis to ensure that our revenues can be restored and we can commit these services. Now, the Leader of the Opposition interjects and talks about how the economy has shrunk. Mr Speaker, he must be the only person in this place who was unaware that we've gone into recession as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition is the only one, I would hope, in this place who would seek to use the COVID-19 crisis of making a cheap political point in this place, Mr Speaker. He must be the only one. But, Mr Speaker, we will be able to commit the funding that is needed in disability care, in aged care, in in-home aged care, in hospitals, Mr Speaker, in education services, because our government has been able to guarantee these essential services because of our ability to manage budgets and our ability, Mr Speaker, to ensure we have a plan, the JobMaker plan, to get Australians back into work, to get the economy back on the right track, Mr Speaker, so you can commit, Mr Speaker,
the Prime Minister's
to those
time
important
has
services.
concluded. And I call the member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Employment, Skills, Small and Family Business. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government's JobMaker plan is backing Australian small businesses to access export markets and grow their businesses to create jobs and help drive the post-coronavirus economic recovery?
The Minister representing the Minister for, also the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology, representing the Minister for Employment.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question, and I thank her for the work that she has been doing in Western Sydney, supporting many businesses, but especially advanced manufacturing businesses in her electorate in Lindsay. Mr Speaker, I'm sure that everyone in this House would agree that Australia has a very well-earned reputation for high-quality products that are very highly valued both here and around the world. And many of our businesses are among the most productive and innovative in the world. Now, our small and medium businesses benefit from the fact that we are a very strong and a very proud trading nation, and that we have a very healthy balance of trade, even over the last few very critical months. And that's why a critical part of our JobMaker plan is backing our export businesses so that they can take advantage of our free trade agreements. Now, Mr Speaker, during the COVID-19 pandemic, I have been so thrilled by the level of support that has been given to Australian businesses and to Australian-made. But it's clear, Mr Speaker, that as a small nation with a population of about 25 million people, the export markets are very important to us. And if we want our small businesses to grow, if we want our medium enterprises to grow, then it's very important that we continue to trade and that we continue to support those businesses to develop the export markets that they need. So, Mr Speaker, we have delivered on our promise to boost funding to further promote the Australian-made logo in overseas markets and to back our Aussie exports. And, Mr Speaker, it's very clear that the Coalition understands the value of promoting Australian businesses, including through the very successful Export Market Development Grants scheme. So we've restored the funding that was taken out of that program. We've increased it with an extra $60 million in last year's budget, and importantly, we have increased it further again by $49.8 million as part of our response to COVID-19. Now, Mr Speaker, our support to small and medium businesses, including our JobKeeper payments, has kept many businesses afloat during this pandemic. But it's very important that we do more than keep our businesses afloat. We need our businesses to do more than stay afloat. We need them to keep swimming. And we need them to get started to do that, to make sure that we are getting all of the benefits that we can into our economy, so that we can grow jobs, so that we can grow our economy. And being a trading nation, we are very well placed now to support our businesses as they come through the COVID pandemic.
The member for Maribyrnong.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Given that many debts to the Commonwealth accrue interest, will his government apply the same principle and refund victims of the Prime Minister's illegal robo-debt scheme in full, including interest?
The Minister for Government Services.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What I find ironic in the last question about the rorts and corruption in Victoria, those opposite were claiming it's before the courts and we can't possibly speak about it. But we know this is before the courts, but we've got the hypocrisy to step up about it. I mean, this is extraordinary. Extraordinary. Those opposite don't want to talk about what's happening in Victoria over the last week, hiding behind sub judice, and come forward with the know full well this is before the courts with hearings.
The Minister will resume his seat. The member for Barton will cease interjecting. The member for Maribyrnong on a point of order.
It's a point of order on relevance, Mr Speaker. It's a very straightforward question. When Australians owe the Commonwealth money, they can be charged interest. When the Commonwealth owes hundreds of thousands of robo-victims money, will they pay interest?
I'll just say, in ruling on that point of order, and I've made this point before, the minister is entitled to a preamble, as robust as that was. Unlike yesterday, I mean, he's a much shorter way into the answer, and he's not even 30 seconds in. So He knows it was a very specific question, and he's had his preamble. The Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I've got a point of order on hypocrisy, and those opposite are covered by it.
Members on both sides. The member for Nichols.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister assisting the Minister for Trade and Investment. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison-McCormack government has acted to ensure Australian export opportunities are maintained through the coronavirus pandemic, so that businesses can keep selling their products as well as keeping Australians in jobs?
The Minister representing the Minister for Trade and Investment.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And on this side of the House, we know that trade is absolutely critical to the prosperity of Australia and country communities around our nation. And I thank the member for Nichols for his question, because he knows only too well the importance of growing export opportunities for his local farmers and local producers, particularly in the Goulburn Valley through iconic local firms such as SPC Ardmona. And we know, Mr Speaker, that on this side of the House that international trade generates no less than 1 in 5 jobs in Australia, and that over the last 5 years alone there have been over 240,000 trade-related jobs created in this country. And so we know that, and we are acutely aware of the importance of foreign markets for our primary producers and our local businesses, because by value, and here's some stats for you, member for Nichols, we are the world's largest exporter of wool, we are the second largest exporter of beef, and the 4th largest exporter of sugar, wine and cotton, Mr Speaker. And, Mr Speaker, international trade, yep, member for Dawson loves the sugar references. And international trade, Mr Speaker, supports commodity prices. So, during this devastating drought, when farmers have had to sell their stock, they haven't had to sell it for a song. And our network of free trade agreements, Mr Speaker, is absolutely crucial to our national success. And we've already delivered in spades through FTAs with key partners such as Japan, Hong Kong, South Korea and China, and also with partners such as Vietnam and also Canada through the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I'm delighted that a host of agricultural producers will reap the benefits of the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which will enter into force on the 5th of July, Mr Speaker. Yep, and under that agreement, 99% of Australian goods will enter Indonesia tariff-free or under very preferential agreements. And our agricultural producers are some of the biggest winners. So, for example, in my electorate of Calare, the cherry producers, Bernard and Fiona Hall, they will be able to start selling their cherries into Indonesia tariff-free from day one of that agreement being implemented. And our beef exporters will enjoy enhanced access to the Indonesian market. So, for example, in the member for Nichols electorate, Ralph's Meats will be able to sell their high-quality beef from the Goulburn Valley right into Indonesia. So it's a big win for country Australia, Mr Speaker, but the coalition won't be resting on our laurels. We're moving on free trade agreement negotiations with the United Kingdom, and we are backing our free trade agreements and backing our farmers and backing our businesses, backing our country communities to ensure jobs, opportunities
The Minister's time
and prosperity.
has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. And I ask, does the Prime Minister agree that it is entirely inappropriate for polling to be done in Tasmania on whether Teddy Sheehan should receive a Victoria Cross?
Just before I call the Prime Minister, I think that's just in order. Yeah, the Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm unaware of what the Leader of the Opposition is referring to. So, Mr Speaker, this is not something that I have any knowledge of. I'll tell you who I'll be listening to, Mr Speaker, on this matter and this matter alone, and that is the expert panel that I have appointed to address the very specific issue regarding the matter of the VC for Teddy Sheehan, a very brave Australian, Mr Speaker. But there are other voices that have spoken on this matter. Les Carline, if Australia were to grant VCs as the result of a government acting on recommendations to this inquiry, referring to the tribunal, we would have introduced a two-tiered system. In other words, there would be a VC and a VC with an asterisk, Mr Speaker. John Howard has said to order honours for past deeds is an inherently hazardous exercise. Retired Brigadier Chris Roberts, a respected military historian, has said retrospective awards would have the potential to cheapen the VC and would have the potential to bring a degree of ridicule on retrospective awards. The Secretary of the Victoria Cross and George Cross Association and London Awards has said to make an award in the Victoria Cross of Australia to someone who performed an action which was not recognised by the award of a Victoria Cross at the time was risking lowering the status of the VC for Australia below that of the Victoria Cross. What all that means, Mr Speaker, is that if you're going to make a decision on these matters, Mr Speaker, you take it very seriously, you consider it all very seriously, and that is exactly what I've done. The panel approach that I've put in place, Mr Speaker, has been done so after I have consulted with the Chief of Defence Force, who was very supportive of the panel approach put in, and I also consulted the Governor-General, Mr Speaker, informing these views. I want to ensure that any recommendation that I might make to Her Majesty would be done on a very careful and considered basis, Mr Speaker, and I am open-minded to the views of the panel that would put it to the government to make a further consideration. Mr Speaker, I have no interest in this matter becoming a matter of political debate for partisan purposes. Mr Speaker, I understand the popularity of this point, which the Leader of the Opposition has sought to engage in. Mr Speaker, I will not engage in such crass popularity, Mr Speaker, when it comes to the integrity of the VC. Mr Speaker, I know my responsibilities on this matter, and I will exercise them very carefully.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. The question was very specific. It just invited the Prime Minister to oppose Pollock, to oppose populism on this. That was the point of the question.
I just say to the Leader of the Opposition, at the very beginning of the Prime Minister's answer, he addressed that issue, and he answered the question. He addressed that issue. Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? The member for Herbert.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government's trade and energy strategy under the JobMaker plan is supporting jobs by creating new markets for Australian energy exports?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Herbert for his question. And he knows that we're focused on opportunities for exporters who can create jobs and drive investment as we come out of COVID-19, including in places like Townsville in his electorate, Mr Speaker. And he also knows that central to this is the need for affordable, reliable energy using a balance of different fuel sources, old technologies and new technologies, to provide that affordable, reliable energy, Mr Speaker. And I've had the chance not so long ago of spending time on the shop floor of the Glencore refinery in his electorate with the workers there, and they know, Mr Speaker, how important exports are and the role they play in our economy and the economy up around Townsville, Mr Speaker, and how important affordable, reliable energy is for them. Now, the good news for those workers and workers right across Australia is that we have now seen 10 consecutive months of wholesale price reductions, even before COVID-19 hit. Indeed, in February this year, before COVID-19 struck, we'd seen wholesale electricity prices across the national electricity market down close to half of where they were just a year before, Mr Speaker. And this means manufacturers, farmers, other users of energy are put in a much stronger position to build their export businesses. And, Mr Speaker, it's no surprise, along with that Australia is now the biggest LNG exporter in the world, Mr Speaker, in the world. What an extraordinary achievement. The people of Queensland and other states, Western Australia, who are playing a role in that, they know how important those jobs are and those industries are to them. But on top of that, Mr Speaker, Mixing the old with the new, we see enormous opportunities in new technologies and fuel sources like hydrogen. And as the Chief Scientist has told us, hydrogen offers us the opportunity to create an industry with 8,000 jobs and about $11 billion worth of revenues, Mr Speaker. Now, we've already invested $500 million into our national hydrogen strategy, including $300 million into the new Advancing Hydrogen Fund, Mr Speaker, and it's crucial as part of that we form partnerships, as we are doing, with our customer countries like Japan and South Korea, who see enormous potential in working with Australia, not just by buying our current exports like coal and gas, but buying new exports like hydrogen and adjacent industries like ammonia, Mr Speaker. Now, it's not just Asian countries that are interested in this, also in Europe, and only today we've seen Germany signalling their interest in importing hydrogen, announcing €2 billion to develop international partnerships, and we will certainly be talking to them about that, Mr Speaker. We're focused on affordable, reliable energy to drive exports and jobs as we come out of COVID-19.
And I call the member for Franklin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Can the minister confirm that as at 31 December 2019, more than 1,130 older Australians are waiting for their approved home care package in the region that covers Eden Monaro?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'll obviously check the record on the specific area in question. I can confirm that across Australia we have seen since 2012 until now an increase from 60,000 to a projected 158,000 home care packages. That is an increase from more than doubling from 60 to 158,000. In the last year, what we have seen is an increase of almost 40,000 packages. And this has all occurred at a time where we've had over $2 billion of additional funding on the watch of the Prime Minister and the Treasurer go into home care packages. So we have gone, just to repeat, from 60,000 to a projected 158,000 over the course of the current forward estimates from what it was. But there is a very interesting point here in making this comparison. Whilst we have contributed on this side over $2 billion for additional home care packages, there was an opportunity for the alternative government to set out how much they would put in at the last budget. And despite over $380 billion of taxes, they had zero in their budget, zero in their budget for home care packages. So as an exemplar of crocodile tears, this is hard to beat. We put in over $2 billion, they claim there's an issue, and they put in nothing.
The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia. And will the Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government's job maker plan is supporting our resource export markets and how this approach is working to secure new jobs? And, importantly, is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Resources, Water and Regional Australia.
Well, thank you for the call, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the honourable member. As we all know, the honourable member is very public in his support of the resources sector, very public in his support. And, Mr Speaker, the government is committed to the sector. We are committed to the resources sector because the sector continues to deliver for Australia, tonne after tonne, job after job. The resources sector is helping us through this very difficult period. They are on track to deliver almost $300 billion worth of GDP to the Australian economy. $300 billion. Now, the industry, Mr Speaker, in this period, in the first 3 months of this year, created over 3,000 new jobs. 3,000 new jobs. That is a fantastic effort. The copper and gold sector continues to grow. Places like Oz Minerals at Carrapateena in the member's electorate produced its first copper concentrate in December of 2019. So we remain committed to the resources sector, to the projects that it brings, to the jobs that it brings, because it's a jobs pipeline, Mr Speaker, a jobs pipeline of projects for Australia. Places like BHP's Olympic Dam, which will continue to provide jobs into the future. We're driving development through critical minerals and the Critical Minerals Facilitation Office. We continue to work with our major trading partners, India, Japan, South Korea, the US, China. All of these trading arrangements are good for this nation, they are good for jobs and good for the economy. But I'm asked about alternatives, Mr Speaker. I'm asked about alternatives. Now, I speak often with the member for Hunter, very often, my shadow counterpart, as you'd expect. He's always been very supportive in private, I have to say, of the resources sector. But imagine my surprise, Mr Speaker. I read on the weekend in The Source, very informative, The Source, by Anika Smethurst, that there's a group of pro-coal Labor MPs. They call themselves the Otis Group, and they have defied the opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, defied the leader of the opposition, holding a secret meeting in Canberra, Mr Speaker. A secret faction, the piece says, a secret faction. Shadow ministers. There are some who support the coal sector publicly, but it is not those opposite. They've had to take it underground, Mr Speaker. I just find this incredible. Where is the public support for what is one of the greatest sectors in this country, Mr Speaker? Now, we will continue to support the resources sector because on this side we understand what it takes to deliver jobs for this country, to continue growth. We will continue to grow it, to mine it, to make it. We will continue to provide opportunities because on this side, Mr Speaker, this side, we are the job makers. Those opposite are job takers. They want to take away from the resources sector the opportunity for Australia's youth, for more jobs, for more opportunities, for more apprenticeships. So, Mr Speaker, I'll say to those opposite again, be public in your support of the resources sector. It is critical to the Australian economy, and long may it be so.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On that important note, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice.